resentment had not arrived all at once. It had accumulated slowly, almost invisibly, like dust settling on polished marble until the surface no longer gleamed. Ivy had spent years convincing herself that she was patient, that she understood how legacy worked within the Forrester dynasty. She had accepted the subtle exclusions, the decisions made without her, the projects reassigned at the last minute under the guise of strategic necessity. She had told herself that talent would eventually speak louder than lineage politics. Yet the truth had hardened inside her like a splinter she could not remove. She had been tolerated, not trusted, praised, but never empowered. The staircase incident had not brought her the triumph she had anticipated. It had stirred chaos, yes, and forced scrutiny upon Steffi. But the board's investigation had stalled in ambiguous conclusions. Sympathy had been fleeting. Whispers still circulated that the fall had been exaggerated. Ivy could sense it in the glances that lingered a second too long, in the conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Instead of consolidating power, she had merely amplified suspicion. The Forrester family closed ranks with a resilience she had underestimated. Even Eric's initial protectiveness had softened into caution. It was then that her anger crystallized into something colder and more methodical. If subtle maneuvering could not destabilize the structure, something more seismic would be required. She no longer wanted incremental influence. She wanted retribution. She wanted the Forrester name to tremble under the weight of vulnerability the way she had trembled under dismissal. There was one name that echoed in her mind with both infamy and potential: Sheila Carter. Los Angeles had never fully escaped Sheila's shadow. Stories of her violence had passed into near legend, recounted in hushed tones as cautionary tales. Murder, manipulation, relentless obsession. Sheila's history was stained with acts most people could scarcely imagine. She was chaos personified, unpredictable and unapologetic. And yet, for Ivy, that unpredictability held a strange allure. Where others saw danger, Ivy saw leverage. It took her several days to convince herself that the plan forming in her mind was not reckless but necessary. She rationalized that desperation often demanded alliances outside conventional morality. If the Forrester family operated under the illusion of invincibility, perhaps they needed a reminder that security was fragile. Sheila understood fragility. Sheila knew how to dismantle it. The evening Ivy drove to Deacon's apartment, the city skyline flickered under a restless wind. The streets were alive with the usual hum of traffic, unaware that within one modest building a conversation was about to unfold that could ripple across the entire Forrester empire. Ivy parked several blocks away, preferring anonymity. She walked the remaining distance alone, her heels clicking softly against the pavement, her expression composed. She felt no hesitation as she approached the door. If anything, she felt anticipation. Deacon answered with a guarded expression, his instinct for trouble sharpened by experience. When Ivy requested to see Sheila privately, his hesitation deepened. But curiosity outweighed caution. He stepped aside. Sheila appeared moments later, her gaze appraising and cool. There was something unsettling about the way she smiled. Warm enough to disarm, sharp enough to wound. She did not ask why Ivy had come. She seemed to already understand that no one sought her out without purpose. Inside the apartment, the air felt dense, as though the walls themselves carried memories of past schemes. Ivy remained standing for a moment, absorbing the presence of the woman before her. Sheila's reputation was not exaggerated. There was a steadiness in her posture that suggested fear was not a language she spoke. "You're bold," Sheila observed, her voice smooth. "Most people prefer to pretend I don't exist." "I'm not most people," Ivy replied evenly. That was the first truth of the evening. They sat across from each other, the silence stretching not with awkwardness but with assessment. Ivy studied Sheila's eyes, searching for instability, for unpredictability. Instead, she found focus. Calculated interest. "I want something," Ivy began, dispensing with pretense. "And I believe you might be interested in something I have." Sheila leaned back slightly, amusement flickering across her features. "Go on." Ivy did not dramatize her grievance. She spoke with precision, outlining her dissatisfaction with the Forrester family's treatment, the marginalization she felt, the pattern of control that had relegated her to the periphery. She did not portray herself as a victim, she framed herself as someone underestimated. She then shifted to specifics. "I can provide information," she said quietly. "Internal schedules, security details, patterns of movement, particularly concerning Steffi." The name hung between them like an invitation. Sheila's expression sharpened. For all her composure, the mention of Steffi ignited something unmistakable. The history between them was volatile, layered with betrayal and violence. Sheila did not disguise her interest. "And in exchange?" she asked softly. Ivy did not hesitate. "I need a competitor removed. Discredited. Ruined. I don't care how. The bluntness of the request did not shock Sheila. If anything, it seemed to earn her respect. The jewelry industry was ruthless in its own way, though rarely in forms that crossed into criminality. Ivy was prepared to cross that line. She elaborated, naming the rival designer whose rising acclaim threatened to eclipse her own work. The woman's brand was gaining traction, her pieces featured in prominent magazines. Ivy framed the rivalry not as envy but as injustice, arguing that the industry favored novelty over legacy, spectacle over craftsmanship. Whether she believed that fully was irrelevant. The resentment was real. Sheila listened without interruption, absorbing every detail. When Ivy finished, the room fell quiet again. You understand what you're offering, Sheila said finally. This isn't gossip. This is access. I understand, Ivy replied. And I understand who you are. There was no tremor in her voice. No flicker of fear. Sheila studied her closely. Most people would be terrified sitting here. I'm not, Ivy said simply. And she wasn't. The knowledge of Sheila's past, of bloodshed, of calculated harm, did not repel her. It intrigued her. It suggested a capacity for action unburdened by conscience. Ivy did not need friendship. She needed effectiveness. Sheila rose and walked toward a small cabinet, retrieving 2 glasses and a bottle. The gesture felt ceremonial. She poured deliberately, the amber liquid catching the dim light. An alliance, then, Sheila murmured, handing 1 glass to Ivy. Ivy accepted it without hesitation. Their glasses met with a soft clink that sounded louder in the quiet apartment than it should have. It was not a toast of celebration but of intention. To opportunity, Sheila said. To justice, Ivy countered. Neither word fully captured the truth of what they were sealing. As they drank, Ivy felt a surge of exhilaration. Not because she was naive to the danger, but because she felt aligned at last with someone who did not pretend to operate within moral boundaries. The Forrester family cloaked their power in elegance and propriety. Sheila did not bother with disguise. That transparency, twisted as it was, felt almost refreshing. The conversation that followed was detailed and methodical. Ivy described the layout of the Forrester mansion, the shifts in security personnel, the timing of Steffi's departures and returns. She spoke of blind spots in surveillance, of predictable routines. Sheila listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed her strategic mind. In return, Sheila outlined subtle ways a competitor's reputation could be dismantled. Rumors seeded strategically, financial discrepancies exposed or fabricated, alliances undermined. She did not commit to violence outright. She did not need to. The implication was sufficient. As the night deepened, the alliance solidified not through grand declarations but through mutual recognition. Both women understood what it meant to feel cast aside. Both harbored grievances that had festered into ambition. When Ivy finally rose to leave, the city outside felt different. The wind had quieted. The streets were nearly empty. She walked back toward her car with a calm that bordered on elation. The alliance she had forged was not impulsive. It was deliberate escalation. She did not dwell on the potential consequences. Fear would have implied doubt, and doubt was a luxury she no longer entertained. In her mind, the Forrester family had already drawn first blood by diminishing her. She was merely responding in kind. Inside the apartment, Sheila watched the door close behind Ivy and allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Access to Steffi's routines was invaluable. Ivy's resentment had provided the opening she had long awaited. 2 women, bound not by affection but by shared hostility, had just altered the balance of Los Angeles' most powerful fashion dynasty. The city remained unaware. The Forrester mansion stood illuminated against the night, serene and secure in appearance. But security, as Ivy now understood intimately, was an illusion sustained only by ignorance. And ignorance was about to end. In the days that followed, Ivy moved through the Forrester mansion with a composure so refined it bordered on serene. To the family, she appeared subdued, perhaps even reflective, as though the recent conflicts had humbled her. She attended meetings with quiet professionalism, contributed to discussions about upcoming campaigns, and offered no outward sign of agitation. Yet beneath that surface calm, her mind operated with disciplined precision. Every schedule she memorized, every shift in Steffi's routine she noted, every adjustment in security staffing she observed became part of a growing internal ledger that she would later translate into leverage. Sheila, true to her nature, did not rush. She understood that effective disruption rarely began with spectacle. It began with observation. The information Ivy provided was not immediately weaponized. Instead, Sheila used it to study patterns. When Steffi left the mansion alone, which entrances were temporarily unattended during shift changes, how long the security cameras looped before overwriting footage. The knowledge was intoxicating, not because it guaranteed immediate harm, but because it restored a sense of proximity. Sheila had always thrived on access. Ivy had handed her a map. Meanwhile, Ivy's own ambition required separate cultivation. The competitor she sought to eliminate was not merely rising. She was poised to secure a distribution deal that could shift the balance of prestige within the jewelry industry. Ivy had convinced herself that this woman's success was undeserved, that it came from flashy branding rather than authentic craftsmanship. Whether that belief was grounded in truth or fueled by envy mattered less than the intensity of her conviction. In her mind, removing this rival was not sabotage, it was correction. Sheila began subtly. Anonymous tips were sent to industry blogs hinting at discrepancies in the competitors' sourcing practices. Questions about ethical compliance surfaced online. None of the accusations were explicit, they were phrased as inquiries. But in an industry built on image, even a whisper of impropriety could stain reputation. Investors grew cautious. Meetings were postponed. The rival designer found herself defending integrity rather than promoting creativity. Ivy followed the developments with restrained satisfaction. She did not publicly engage with the rumors. Instead, she positioned herself as composed and focused, allowing comparison to do its work. The more her competitor appeared embattled, the more Ivy seemed stable. It was a strategy rooted in patience rather than spectacle. Yet the alliance's darker dimension loomed closer to activation. One evening, as Steffi prepared to leave the office after a late meeting, she sensed something intangible shift in the atmosphere. It was not an obvious threat, not a visible breach. It was the faint awareness of being observed. The parking structure felt too quiet. The usual security guard was momentarily absent, replaced by someone she did not recognize. The unease dissipated quickly, replaced by rational explanation. But seeds of vulnerability had been planted. Sheila did not act recklessly. She did not approach Steffi directly. Instead, she orchestrated moments of proximity that were plausible deniability in motion. A car that trailed slightly too long before turning away. A delivery left at the wrong entrance. Small disturbances that unsettled without proving intent. The objective was psychological destabilization. If Steffi felt unsafe, if she began to question her environment, her authority would erode from within. Ivy observed Steffi more closely now, searching for cracks in composure. In meetings, she detected a slight edge in Steffi's tone, a quicker impatience. Anxiety, once introduced, is difficult to conceal. Ivy experienced a thrill not of cruelty alone but of validation. The family that had treated her as peripheral was beginning to feel peripheral itself. Uncertain, reactive, yet beneath the exhilaration lay an undercurrent Ivy did not fully acknowledge. She had aligned herself with a force historically uncontrollable. Sheila's hatred towards Steffi was not strategic, it was visceral. Ivy's objective was leverage and industry dominance. Sheila's motives extended into territory Ivy could not entirely predict. One night, Ivy returned to Deacon's apartment for an update. The atmosphere was different this time, less ceremonial, more charged. Sheila outlined the progress made in destabilizing the jewelry competitor. The designer's financial backers were wavering. Contracts were being reviewed. It was only a matter of time before confidence collapsed. Then Sheila shifted the conversation. "She's nervous," Sheila said softly, referring to Steffi. "You can see it in her eyes." Ivy nodded. "Good, but nervous people make mistakes," Sheila continued. "And mistakes can escalate." The statement was not a warning, it was an invitation. Ivy felt a flicker of hesitation for the first time. Not fear of Sheila, but recognition of momentum. Escalation meant unpredictability. It meant crossing thresholds from manipulation into potential harm. "What are you suggesting?" Ivy asked carefully. "That proximity can become confrontation," Sheila replied, her smile thin. "You gave me access. Now you decide how far we go." The responsibility hovered between them. Ivy returned home that night with the weight of choice pressing against her resolve. She had sought disruption, not bloodshed. Yet she had knowingly partnered with someone whose history was stained by it. The line between intimidation and danger was thin, and she stood uncomfortably close to it. Back at the mansion, Electra began noticing subtle changes in Ivy. There was a new intensity in her gaze, a sharper attentiveness to Steffi's whereabouts. Electra, still trusting, attributed it to protective instinct. She did not see the larger architecture forming around her. Meanwhile, the jewelry competitor's collapse accelerated. A major retailer withdrew its support, citing concerns over pending investigations that had never formally materialized. The designer's brand faltered under speculation. Ivy's collection filled the vacuum with calculated grace. Her pieces featured prominently in industry spreads. Publicly, it appeared as though talent had triumphed. Privately, Ivy felt both victorious and unsettled. The alliance with Sheila had proven effective. But effectiveness came at a cost. She could no longer pretend that her actions were isolated maneuvers within corporate rivalry. She had invited chaos into proximity with her family. Even if she convinced herself that Steffi deserved discomfort, the potential fallout extended beyond a single target. One evening, as she stood alone in the mansion's library, Ivy contemplated the magnitude of what she had set in motion. The shelves around her were lined with volumes chronicling fashion history, innovation born from vision rather than vengeance. She ran her fingers along the spine of a book detailing the brand's founding years and felt an unexpected pang. Was this truly justice? Or had she allowed resentment to eclipse purpose? The question lingered only briefly before resolve resurfaced. The Forresters had thrived for decades because they understood power. She was merely learning to wield it without apology. Elsewhere, Steffi confronted Ridge about the growing unease she felt. She could not articulate proof, only instinct. Ridge dismissed the idea of imminent danger but increased security measures nonetheless. Cameras were recalibrated, guards were rotated, the mansion's gates remained closed more frequently. Sheila noticed immediately. The game had shifted from subtle disturbance to strategic chess. Every move triggered countermeasures. Ivy watched the developments with sharpened awareness. She realized that containment might soon become impossible. When she next met Sheila, the tension between them was palpable. Sheila had tasted access and would not relinquish it easily. Ivy sensed that their objectives were diverging. Hers rooted in professional ascendancy. Sheila's in personal vendetta. You wanted her unsettled, Sheila reminded her. Now she is. I wanted leverage, Ivy replied. Not chaos. Sheila's eyes narrowed slightly. Sometimes they're the same. The statement chilled Ivy more than any overt threat could have. For the first time since initiating the alliance, Ivy understood that control was not absolute. She had opened a door she might not fully close. Back at Forrester Creations, the board praised Ivy's latest sales figures. The competitor's downfall had positioned her as a rising force. She accepted the congratulations with measured humility. Outwardly, she had achieved what she set out to accomplish. Yet the mansion no longer felt stable. The security presence, the strained conversations, the subtle paranoia, it all signaled that equilibrium had fractured. Ivy had wanted the Forresters to feel vulnerable. They did, but vulnerability is contagious. The episode closed on a split image. In the mansion, Steffi stood by the window, scanning the darkened grounds with wary eyes. Across town, Sheila watched surveillance photos spread across a table, studying patterns with predatory focus. And in the space between them, Ivy stood alone in her room, staring at her reflection, the faintest shadow of doubt crossing her face. She had found an ally who mirrored her resentment and ambition. She had ignited disruption in a family that once dismissed her. But alliances forged in hatred are unstable by nature. The question no longer centered on whether she could destabilize the Forresters. It centered on whether she could survive the storm she had helped summon.